Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation. As you found out a couple minutes ago, I'm Jim Van Epps, Chair of the Council's Program Committee and host for this evening's presentation by Dr. Britta Glennon, entitled The Missing Pieces of the Immigration Debate. And before I begin, I'd like to thank, as Chip got to a minute ago, but I'd like to add a couple more names. The outgoing board officers, I'd like to thank them all for their stellar service over the past couple of years. That includes Chip as the outgoing president, Becky Cheatham as vice president, Melise Watley as treasurer, Dr. Olavi Ahrens as recording secretary, and Dr. Byron Boyd as corresponding secretary. The board and the council are supported by 8 committee chairs. And as you know, this is an all volunteer council. And altogether, these officers and chairs have put in a lot of time to make this council's program happen, to provide timely articles and notices, and maintain the website. So thank you to all involved. I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors for Dr. Glennon's presentation. First, Kreitz Auto Group is a platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council for 2020-2021. And that's your exclusive local dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Sprinter vans. Actually, Kreitz is a continuing sponsor this year, and we appreciate their support. Thank you, Kreitz Auto Group. This evening's program sponsors include Ellis Painter, Rattery, and Adams, LLP, with its rich history of delivery of superior legal services, professionalism, and long-term commitment to its clients. Also, the Learning Center is a sponsor this evening, with its program of senior citizens, that is, which provides intellectually engaging, humanities-based educational programs. We're grateful to the Learning Center for their sponsoring of tonight's program, and thank you to both sponsors. Our presentation this evening, as I mentioned, is by Dr. Britta Glennon, entitled The Missing Pieces of the Immigration Debate. Dr. Glennon is an assistant professor at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania and a National Bureau of Economic Research faculty research fellow. Her research is at the intersection of innovation, strategy, and international business, and broadly focuses on the challenging structure of the high-skilled activities of multinational firms. Dr. Glennon studies innovation and technological change with a special focus on the changing structure of the research and development activities of multinational firms, which account for the majority of innovation investment worldwide. Her work has been featured in media outlets such as The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Bloomberg. Dr. Glennon holds a BA in economics and East Asian studies, Chinese in particular, from Cornell University, a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago, and a PhD in public policy from Carnegie Mellon University. So to the topic of her presentation, the question of the impact of immigration on the host country has long been controversial, but it's risen to the forefront of political debates in recent years. Unexpected political shifts, such as the Brexit vote and the election of President Trump, have been attributed to voter concern about immigration. The debate is largely centered on whether immigrants displace native workers and/or reduce native wages. But this narrow focus on native labor market effects is incomplete. To really understand the market effects of immigration, one must also consider the effects on the other pillars of economic growth, innovation, and investment, as well as the role of the firm in this presentation. Dr. Glennon will provide an overview of the economic effects of immigration, as well as a discussion of some of the unintentional consequences that arise when policy makers restrict immigration. And then following Dr. Glennon's presentation, she will take questions from our viewers that can easily be sent to her by the Zoom Q&A function on your computer or your iPad. Just click on the Q&A icon on your screen. A box will appear in which your question can be typed, and then click on the box's send button. I suggest you send your questions as soon as they come to you, as we will field them here And the earlier we receive them, the better chance your questions will have of being asked. Dr. Glennon's presentation, including Q&A, is projected to add around 8 o'clock. So it's my honor to present Dr. Britta Glennon. Dr. Glennon, it's great to have you join us this evening, although we wish it could have been in person here with us in Savannah. Dr. Glennon, please.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I also wish I could have been there in person, but this will have to do for now. We're all having some significant changes in our life this year, but let's hope that that ends sooner rather than later. Okay, so let me just share my slides. Can you all see my slides okay?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Well, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm really excited to be talking about one of my favorite topics, immigration. I've somewhat provocatively titled this presentation, "The Missing Pieces of the Immigration Debate," because I'm really hoping to reframe the way immigration is usually talked about. So I'll start out evaluating some of the standard claims made in the traditional way immigration is discussed and why it's been so controversial. And then I'll add some new facts and perspectives stemming from my own research as well as research from some others. And the other thing that I'll just note up front is that the type of immigration that I'm really focused on is legal immigration and especially skilled immigration. That's really where my particular expertise is. So that's kind of the focus of. Okay, so let's begin. I do have to give a quick disclaimer, which is that some of the data that I use in my own research is confidential and from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so I have to be clear that these views do not reflect positions of the US Department of Commerce. And I've taken all the necessary precautions to maintain confidentiality. Okay, so immigration has been a controversial topic for a very long time. It's of course risen to the forefront in recent years, both in the US with the election of Donald Trump and in Europe with a similar rise in anti-immigration right-wing populists. Right? So this is kind of a more recent trend. In the US, the focus has often been on illegal immigration, on building the wall on the border with Mexico, but actually high-skilled legal immigration has also been extremely contentious. So just to give you kind of a sense for this is an incomplete list of kind of all the increased restrictions on skilled immigration in the last few years, but it's meant to give you an idea. So in September 2019, the refugee cap was cut to about a quarter of its original size. This past summer, there were a whole series of executive orders that were issued targeting green cards, work visas, student visas, spouses of work visas. And then in October, there were a series of additional restrictions placed on the H-1B process. We'll be talking more about the H-1B visa later, but this is a skilled work visa. It's the primary skilled visa that we have in the US. But perhaps even more significant than these specific executive orders have actually been kind of this more systematic change in the way that agencies have processed these visa applications. So the Trump administration issued 45% more challenges to H-1B visa requests than the Obama administration had. Requests for evidence have tripled. As you can see in this graph, rejection rates have quadrupled. And more generally, there's a massive backlog in applications. And at least part of this is due to deliberate processing loads. Now, of course, we're now, as of yesterday, under a new administration, but it remains to be seen how these policies are going to change under the new administration. If there are no changes, the NFAP estimates that legal immigration to the US could fall in half. So legal skilled immigration has very much been under attack in the United States. And I want to be clear that this is controversial around the world, right? So as you can see in this graph on the left, it was the #1 cited reason for Brexit. So this bar on the left states the number of whether people stated immigration as being their first, second, third, or fourth primary reason for wanting to leave the EU, and this purple bar says it's their first, right? So you can see that's the primary reason. And this right graph shows kind of a general rise of nationalism in Europe using the percentage of votes won by nationalist parties. And so you can see countries like Hungary and Austria here have these sizable nationalist forces, but no country in Europe, appears to be exempt. And of course, one of the main platforms for these nationalist parties is anti-immigration policy. And it's worth noting that there are many countries that have always been opposed to immigration. So Denmark is typically thought of as quite a progressive nation, but it actually has some of the most aggressive anti-immigration policies in Europe. They have done things like take out advertisements, warning potential migrants that they're not welcome, authorizing police to seize cash and valuables from arriving asylum seekers. The Gulf states are well known for welcoming temporary labor, but they're really not given any means of staying more permanently. And in much of Asia, it's nearly impossible to be naturalized, and immigrants are generally not. So why is this, right? So why are so many countries, the US and elsewhere, opposed to really all types of immigration? So let me show you some quotes that eliminate the one common viewpoint, which is that many believe that each immigrant will take a job away from a citizen. So here's a quote from the Coalition for the Future American Worker, where they say, our government is still bringing in 1.5 million foreign workers a year to take American jobs. Another quote from Representatives Lamar Smith and Gary Miller write, the numbers are simple. At last estimate, there are 8 million illegal immigrants in the US labor force, and there are more than 15 million unemployed American citizens and legal immigrants. So if we were just to enforce the current immigration laws, we would cut unemployment in half. Right? So these folks have this viewpoint that each immigrant is taking a job away from an immigrant. Another common viewpoint is that immigrants drive down the wages of American workers. And you can see that from these quotes. So this quote on the left comes from the AFL-CIO. And they write, high tech is not looking to bring in H-1B visa holders for a few years at a time because there's a shortage. This is really just about dollars and cents. And then we have Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas saying, look, some people say that immigration doesn't depress wages, but the law of supply and demand is not magically suspended in the labor market. As immigrant labor has flooded the country, working class wages have come up. Now, since Senator Cotton invokes the law of supply and demand in his argument, I thought I would actually start there in evaluating kind of the traditional arguments against immigration. So if you'll just bear with me for the next few slides as I go back to some kind of basic Econ 101 graphs that I think are quite useful in evaluating these things. So many of you have seen a standard supply and demand graph before. So for this very simple example, we're talking about apples. Okay, that's our good of interest. So we have our quantity of apples on the x-axis here, the price of apples on the y-axis here. We have our upward sloping supply curve, right, which is that as prices go up, companies will want to supply more apples. And the blue line is a downward sloping demand curve, right? And so the idea here is as prices go up, consumers will buy fewer. Okay, so now let's say there's a really good harvest of apples one year, okay? There's suddenly far more apples available. This causes the supply curve of apples to shift to the right, and this causes the price of apples to fall. Okay, so this is fairly straightforward. So now let's think about this for workers, all right? So here we have the same graph, but now instead of quantity of apples on the x-axis, we have quantity of workers or employment. And then on the y-axis, instead of price of apples, we have wages is the price of labor. The demand and supply curves look the same, right? So supply curve still shifts upward. More people will want to work as wages increase, and the demand curve still slopes down. More companies will want to employ workers as the cost of hiring those workers. So what immigration does is it increases this total number of workers, okay? The domestic supply of workers stays the same. That's this green curve here. But there's now more total workers. That's this new red curve. Okay, so the gap between these two is basically all of the new immigrant workers. So what happens? Okay, well, you can see here that at first glance, immigrants do lower native wages. Okay, so here's the new equilibrium point that sets the wage, and you can see that the wage is in fact much lower after immigration. In addition, it also means that there are fewer native workers employed. Okay, so here at the original equilibrium wage price, the domestic supply was here, and now it's moved down here, right? And the idea here is that, at this lower wage, many domestic workers are just going to stop working. They're not willing to work at that lower wage. There's now really a shortage of domestic labor that's going to be filled by immigrants if the wage is low. Okay, so immigrants are going to be working. All right, so if I were to stop here, you might think that Senator Cotton's argument is correct, right? So the laws of supply and demand perhaps do suggest that immigration reduces wages and reduces jobs for natives. Here's the problem though. People are not apples, okay? And to add to that, in the labor market, unlike the apple market, demand is actually likely to increase when more immigrants enter. So there should be shifts in both the supply and the demand. So why is that? First, because immigrants are going to spend the money that they earn. They're going to spend it on goods produced by workers, which is going to increase demand. And second, because immigrants also create jobs through founding firms. So a recent paper found not only that immigrants are 80% more likely to start new firms, but that this is true for all firm sizes. So as you can see in this graph on the right, the x-axis is firm size, and the y-axis is the number of firms of that size created. And this blue solid line is immigrant-founded firms, and this dashed straight line is native. So immigrant founder firms actually create 42% more jobs than native founders. So in this graph, which is the end of the little demand and supply lesson, thank you for bearing with me. Basically, you can see that the demand curve will actually also shift out. So it's not just that the supply curve shifts, it's also that the demand curve. Because demand also increases, in fact, a small or even non-existent effect on immigration on wages is actually completely consistent with the law of supply and demand. Right? So depending on the size of that demand shift, there actually may be no impact on employment and a small or even non-existent effect on wages. This is really the same reason that doubling the US population since 1950 has not led to 50%. So that's what the standard theory tells us, the laws of supply and demand, right? So they don't necessarily predict any change in native wages or employment. And so what does the empirical evidence say? Well, if we look at a recent report by the National Academies of Science, they put together 14 international experts who reviewed all of the evidence on immigration's economic effects in economics, sociology, demography, et cetera. And they really found very little empirical evidence that immigrants displace native workers or reduce their wage. This is not, the empirical evidence seems to match up with the predictions from the law of supply and demand. So basically, in terms of labor market effects, native labor market effects, really the effect is going to depend a bit on how much that demand curve shifts out, the slope of that demand curve. But the bottom line is that immigrants may reduce wages and employment levels, but it's certainly not going to be one for one. It's likely going to be much smaller. So this is kind of the way the typical immigration debate goes, right? Where it's really focused on what are the effects of on the native labor market. I've shown you some evidence suggesting they don't seem to be big, but let's even put that aside for a moment and think about what's missing from that typical debate. And what I argue is actually the firm is really what's missing, and especially the multinational. A vivid example of this oversight actually comes from a very classic survey of the immigration literature in economics, which doesn't even mention the word firm. And this is especially strange because firms are actually the ones who hire these workers. And in addition, at least in the US, many skilled visas are firm sponsored. And in particular, when we think about multinational companies, this is an even more problematic oversight because these companies are making employment decisions at the global level. And this means that they actually have an alternative option. When they are restricted in the number of foreign workers that they can hire in the US, they can, at least in theory, simply hire those workers abroad instead. They already have global operations. They already are looking at a global labor market, right? And so there's no reason why they can't just hire those workers abroad instead. And this, of course, has really significant policy implications. So if multinational firms do, in fact, simply hire foreign labor abroad when they're restricted from hiring that labor at home, this really implies that those restrictive migration policies can backfire. So instead of increasing employment and earnings of natives, which is what these policies are usually trying to do, although we've just discussed that that might not be especially effective, it may instead actually send those jobs elsewhere. So in short, even though much of the debate has really been about the effect of immigration on native jobs and wages, there's actually this entirely separate potential unintended consequence here that's really been overlooked in both the public and the academic discussion. There is some anecdotal evidence already that multinational firms do indeed offshore in response to immigration restrictions. And so here's a quote from Amazon where they're saying, look, we're interested in hiring these 7 candidates. They're all from other countries. And if we can't get visas for them, then we'll just put them in other countries. Here's a quote from Microsoft saying that they set up their Vancouver foreign affiliate for the purpose of holding anyone who they have H-1B issues with, right? So it allows the company to recruit and retain highly skilled people affected by immigration issues in the US. This comes from a confidential interview that I conducted with the manager of an R&D foreign affiliate in India. And they actually explicitly said, look, we set up this site in response to growing restrictions on H-1B visas. Headquarters decided if we could not bring the talent to the US, then we would go where the talent was. And most recently, the founder of Duolingo wrote on Twitter that if US policies against immigration continue, we'll be forced to move jobs and inspiration to Toronto. However, prior to my research, it was really unknown whether offshoring was a systematic response, right? So there are these anecdotal examples. We really didn't know whether this is something that was commonly done, whether this was actually, a large response to immigration. And so what I do is I basically look at US multinational companies and I look at how their foreign affiliate employment changes in response to changes in the H-1B visa restrictions. Okay, so what are H-1B visas? So these are 3-year work visas. They're for skilled workers. They're typically used for IT workers with at least a bachelor's degree, although it's certainly not only IT workers, other sectors as well. Many of them come from China and India, although once again, those are not the only country of origin. They're often used to hire foreign graduates of US universities. And the other important thing to note is that these visas are tied to the firms, right? So it's not, immigrants are not the ones who apply for these visas, the firms do. So the firms say, we want to hire you, they submit this application for that individual. So they are the ones who determine the demand, they're the ones who have to pay the fee for each application. And one of the things that allows me to look at this question is I'm linking 3 different data sets at the firm level that allow me to look not only at how constrained each firm feels in terms of the immigrants they're able to hire, but also those reactions, their reactions to those constraints. And so the first data set is they're called the labor condition application data from the Department of Labor. These are basically the applications for the H-1B visas. So through this, I can basically see how many visas does each firm want. The second one are I-129 H-1B visa applications from US Customs and Immigration Services. And these are on how many visas they actually get, right? So I'm able to basically compare how many visas each firm wants and how many visas each firm gets, right? So this allows me to measure the constraints that each firm. The third data set comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So these are confidential data on US multinational companies. So it's all their sort of financial and operating characteristics, not just in the US, but abroad as well. And this allows me to basically see how they respond to these changes in constraints, right? So do they increase their foreign affiliate employment? Do they reduce their foreign affiliate employment? What happens there? So more explicitly, what I do is I look at how this employment changed before and after this policy shock in 2004. And so just to give you a little bit of background here, there's the number of H-1B visas that can be issued to private sector businesses has been subject to a cap since the Immigration Act of 1990. That cap is set by Congress and the president, and I've plotted it here on the pan. So on the x-axis is the year, and on the y-axis, it's basically the number of visas that the government will issue. Okay, so you can see that so in the early 2000s, there were nearly 200,000 visas that could be issued a year, and then there was this massive. And so what I do is I basically look at how multinational companies change their employment abroad before and after this policy. So the idea is that before 2004, many of these firms really didn't feel constrained at all. They could hire as many immigrants as they wanted. But after 2004, they were really constrained. Suddenly, they could only get a fraction of the visas that they requested. So in response to these new constraints, I do find a very strong increase in employment abroad. And so in this graph, this kind of summarizes my entire paper. So this red line here is the policy change. And what you can see is that these are kind of treatment firms, and these are a set of control firms. You see this massive increase in foreign affiliate employment after this policy change, right? So when the quota was lowered by 75%, multinational firms increased foreign affiliate employment. And it basically works out to about 0.3 foreign affiliate jobs for each denied H-1B. Now, this previous graph is talking about what happens at existing foreign affiliates. right? So if you are a firm, a multinational firm that already has offices in Canada and China, et cetera, you're increasing your employment at those offices. But in addition, I actually find that firms also opened new foreign affiliates in response to these restrictions. So they not only increased their employment at existing foreign affiliates, they also actually opened up entirely new offices. And in particular, these were often R&D performing high skill. So these highly affected firms were 6% more likely to open a new R&D performing after that policy change. And this is consistent with one of the anecdotes that I started out with, right? So this quote where they say, if we could not bring the talent to the US, we would go where the talent was. And we set up this site to do so. In terms of which firms were most likely to do so, so R&D intensive firms, this makes sense. We're talking about skilled immigrants here. And so it makes sense that firms in kind of more skill intensive R&D intensive industries would be most likely to respond, who would be most impacted by this. Software firms were highly impacted as well. Firms in offshoreable services sectors. So obviously not every type of firm is actually able to hire people in other countries, right? Perhaps the tasks don't offshore well, right? So obviously firms in sectors where there are more offshoreable tasks were more likely to do this. And then of course, firms that tend to rely pretty heavily on which countries appear to have benefited. So first, perhaps unsurprisingly, India and China, right? So this is the idea of companies are going to see talent, right? So many of these immigrants are coming from India and China. And so it looks as though many of these firms simply just hired Indian and Chinese workers in their home country rather than in the US. But countries like Canada also really benefited. And the reason here is, of course, it's very close. There are more open immigration policies. And so for some of these like Silicon Valley firms, for example, hiring workers at your Vancouver offices perhaps isn't that different from hiring them in Silicon Valley or Seattle, etc. And then the one natural question that comes up here, right, is what, right? So what if these jobs go abroad? And I would argue that one of the real reasons why we should be concerned about this is because of all of the positive spillover effects that now go to other countries. So not just the jobs, but everything that's associated with those jobs. And in particular, investment, innovation, and startup activity are likely to fall. And so just highlighting some of the existing research that shows the links between immigration and these other factors here. So first, immigration stimulates bilateral trade and FDI. And so research has shown, for example, that foreign companies are more likely to invest in the US when there are immigrants here. And so that investment from foreign firms would go elsewhere, right? Second, immigrants tend to patent much more than natives. And not only do they tend to patent more, but they actually tend to bring a set of kind of new knowledge and new ideas that is quite complementary to the existing knowledge ideas here, right? And so what this means is that they actually tend to make natives more innovative as well. And so research that has looked at reductions in skilled immigration historically have actually shown that it led to a reduction in patenting by Americans as well. So not just the immigrants weren't patenting in the US because they were somewhere else, but also Americans were negatively impacted. And then third, as I've already touched upon, immigrants seem to be much more entrepreneurial. So in fact, almost half of Fortune 500 companies were founded by American immigrants or their children. So what are the takeaways to all of this? Well, in response to the classic debate, it actually does not necessarily appear to be true that immigrants displace native workers one-to-one. And it seems as though at least some of the critics of immigration do not seem to realize that immigrants are not the same as apples when talking about supply. Right, so there's this demand increase as well. So this is a somewhat naive view. But perhaps even more important is the piece that's really been left out of the traditional debate. And that's the fact that restrictions on immigration actually lead to the offshoring of those jobs. Right? So they tend to not go to Americans and actually go abroad instead. And then that, if they're going abroad instead, that can also be then followed by immigration, startup activity, and investment. So what's the bottom line? The policies that are motivated by concerns about the loss of native high-skilled jobs may backfire, and instead send jobs, innovation, and investment, and enhance economic growth to other countries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Glennon, really interesting and in-depth, excellent presentation on aspects of immigration that many of us haven't seen, discussed, or debated. And now it's time to address those questions that have come to us. And of the mix, I'm going to start off with one that will ask, what percentage of legal immigrants to the United States do you have an assessment, can be classified as skilled as opposed to unskilled?
So in the US, our system, unlike most other countries, is skewed towards unskilled. So countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia in particular have a points-based system where they strongly prefer skilled immigrants, and that's the pool that they draw from. Because ours is more of a family-based system, we actually have far more unskilled than skilled.
Mm-hmm. Can you, for a second, or when you can, take off the share screen
Yeah, sorry.
button, please?
There we go.
Not that folks want to necessarily see me, but just to know there's a face with the questions. So a question that comes in from Richard Danner, and he asked, and you touched on this to some extent, and Richard asked his question probably within the first half of your presentation, but his question was, overall wages might not be depressed, but what segments have wages being depressed by an increased supply?
So as I mentioned, most of the evidence suggests that there has not been much of a decrease, but where there has been, where researchers have found any effect at all has been in the subgroups that are most similar to the immigrants. And so actually it tends to be previous immigrants that are most likely to be hit by this, ironically enough. And so if you look kind of at skill breakdowns, it's really just the closest they're the most likely to be in.
Okay. And some related ones here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask, is there, what kind of a reaction do you get from multinational corporations relative to your work? What do you hear when you talk to them? What's their response like?
Some of them do not want to talk about it. Some of them, when I tell them it will be confidential, are happy to talk about it, and they acknowledge that this is what they do. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I can't cite names, right? But yeah, I mean, this is consistent with what I've been told in interviews. Yeah.
Okay. So let me ask a similar question, but it just came in a little differently than I was going to ask it. So I've got two different ways of doing this. But the question is, how do our legislators respond to this? And as a question just asked, the tail of that was, how do we go about it? How do we go about educating those legislators? You mentioned You mentioned Tom Cotton in particular.
Yeah, so I, unfortunately have not been able to talk to any policymakers directly about this. So the main ways that I've been getting, this message out is through things like this, or things like, doing interviews with various newspaper outlets, going on the radio, et cetera. And so, I am confident that they've seen it because, for example, there was a lawsuit filed by a large group of technology companies in the fall that was protesting the executive orders that I mentioned that took place over the summer, and they cited my work in that. And so policymakers have certainly seen it, but none of them have approached me or talked to me about it. So I'm not sure. I would love to get their ear. Yeah.
A couple other questions, and I'm reading Dan's. I haven't really analyzed Dan's, so you're just getting this right up front here, Dr. Glennon. Dan says, when I was in the globalization business, the big infotech outsourcers seemed to game the system, overloading the request pool, so it was fully subscribed within the first week. Would we be better served to set aside quotas to enable smaller firms to have a shot at this talent pool?
Yeah, so actually one of my biggest critiques of our current system is it has allowed them, and it means that some firms who really need these skilled immigrants are not getting them. And so I 100% agree with that assessment. And I think, getting rid of the cap and having, well, at the very minimum, the way it's currently allocated when there are too many applications is it's through a lottery process, and it's completely random. And so there's no assessment of need. And so even if you kept the cap, at least allocating those visas by need, whether that's, salary or some other measure, would be much more effective and would certainly help get rid of that issue of these outsourcing.
Okay. So a couple related, I'm going to leave them after this next question. This comes from Yasik, who asks, do we have any numbers that estimate job losses that have resulted from the Trump administration and maybe not just that administration, but other, based on their restrictive immigration policies?
Yeah, so I do want to be clear, this is by no means just the Trump administration. This restrictive policy has been in place for a long time. If
I could jump in for a second, and I'm sorry, you and I haven't had this. This is not a political organization, and we really try to stay neutral in our questions. Yeah. But if we have a question that appears to be relevant, I'll try and ask it as neutrally as I can. And I apologize to those that I might not come off as neutral as you might hope I would. But please go ahead, Dr. Glennon.
Yeah, I mean, and that's certainly the way that I try to present the evidence as well, is that this is not a political agenda. This is I believe that the evidence all points in one direction. But in terms of actual numbers, I actually don't think that there is a good estimate out there. So I wish I had an answer for that question, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
So the two questions that I'm going to combine here, in essence, one comes from Charles and one comes from Richard. And the question is, do you have a recommended immigration policy for the United States? And then piggybacking on that, if you were advising the president, would you advise that we get away from a family-based or family-connected system to a more skilled needs system?
So one thing that I want to be careful about here is that I think sometimes there's too much of a focus on just skilled labor, right? And it can mean that you have, neuroscientists coming in working as taxi drivers because there's actually not a need for neuroscientists, right? But you prioritize them because they're highly skilled, right? So you want to kind of attach it to the needs of the economy in some way. So one of the reasons why the US doesn't have a points-based system is because it's meant to be tied to firm needs, right? The problem is that the cap does not reflect that, right? And so the cap doesn't change depending on how the economy is doing. There's no basis on the sector, et cetera. If you got rid of the cap and instead had some kind of allocation mechanism based on need, that would be, in my mind, much more effective. And I also want to say that to connect to this, investing in education is also a much more effective response for this, right? So if firms are able to find the skilled workers they need in the US, then they don't have to need them.
So that's a good segue. You're reading my screen here. Olavi in the next question asks, foreign students at US universities are a good pool, obviously, for tech-savvy workers. What's happened to student visas in recent years?
Yeah, so student visas, I believe, have not been substantially affected, although that's a little bit out of my area, so I'm not 100% sure. The part that's really been affected is that there's been a decline in the number of foreign students who want to come to the US. And that is because they know that there are going to be fewer opportunities for them afterwards. Right? So one of the ways that immigrants used to come to the US was through the education system. So the best and brightest would come, be educated here, and then they'd be hired by firms. And that's just no longer, it's often no longer true, right? And so that has meant that more and more foreign students are going to universities in countries that have more open immigration.
What was that last?
Pathway.
So more and more foreign students are going to universities in other countries that have more open immigration policies.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay, that answers your question, Olavi, and I know you'll be wanting to talk about that next time I see you. So thank you. Next question comes from Sherry, and it has to do with the agricultural sector, okay? And the agricultural sector is heavily dependent, obviously, on immigrant labor, much of which is illegal.
Yep.
Would you recommend putting in place programs like the Braceros program, currently that was implemented during World War II, to help with this important sector of the economy?
Yeah, so this isn't 100% my expertise, but from the research that I've seen, it seems pretty clear that getting rid of the Bracero policy really directly impacted the number of illegal immigrants that come into the US. And so if you were to reinstate that program, I think you would have much fewer illegal immigrants than you'd have you'd be able to kind of meet the need of without
any indication, excuse me, and any indication, anything like that might be, I know that's an up and down, any insight as to what's happening or what might happen?
So, President Biden has stated that immigration is one of his top priorities,
Sure.
but I did not see anything in his plans about re-implementing something like that.
Okay, and you've really set the hook in Jacek, because Jacek has another question for you. He said, I understand you're focusing on skilled and legal immigration. He said, I've read that there's compelling evidence that illegal and unskilled immigration definitely and empirically does depress wages in the unskilled sector of the market, the unskilled sector. Would you comment on that, please?
My understanding is that, so once again, it's only for the direct comparison. So I've seen that it affects, for example, teen workers, right? So teenagers who will work at McDonald's part-time, they might have fewer hours afterwards. So again, you have to think about what's the closest comparison group. So very similar unskilled workers are likely to have some impact.
Okay, and one last question, if I could, and it relates to what I thought I read in one of your slides. And you said you talked about firms most likely to offshore in response to skilled immigration restrictions.
Mhm.
I understand you know a lot of your discussion was on the IT sector. Are there other sectors that would be influenced that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually ran this study on so the whole economy as well as taking out the IT sector, and you still see an effect. And so it seems to be concentrated in services, professional services. So think about like accounting, consulting, these types of firms. And this makes sense, right? Because that's something that is not so tied to geography, right?
Sure.
So any of those types of are likely to offshore.
Yeah, I think I have anyway, worked for a firm that absolutely moved out of New York and said, we can go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania and do all of these parts of our business that had been done at One Penn Plaza and do it a lot cheaper. Now it's not overseas, but that's kind of an indication of the thinking that businesses had to go through and will continue, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So my last question that I have is, with all this writing and all this thinking, do you have a book coming out?
I do not. So in my field, we tend to not write books. It tends to be papers instead.
Yeah,
I have kind of a research agenda of sort of papers that will be coming out, but no book, at least as of yet.
Okay. If you wouldn't mind, if you could indulge us, Brooks Barrett just came in with a question, and Brooks, if you could unmute yourself and ask that question directly, please do so.
Maybe not.
Yeah, the Immigration Act of '65. Do you think that had a long-term deleterious effect on our ability to attract the right people to this country?
So the 1965 Immigration Act, I'm actually less familiar with. So the 1991 is the big one that I know.
65 started preference for families with some, but it principally took us away from skill points, if you want to call it that, and directed more towards families.
Yeah.
And sort of lowered the skill set that needed to come.
Yeah.
That was the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. So the 1990 Immigration Act, I think, was in part a response to that. So that's where things like the H-1B program were implemented. But I mean, I don't think that the current balance of immigration is probably the best one for the U.S. economy. I think some level of family-based immigration is not a bad thing, but I certainly think that we should be increasing the number of skilled immigrants that we're allowing into the country. I think it's not only detrimental to the U.S., but it's actually sort of handing over, that skilled human capital that has been a big part of the American engine for a while.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Glennon, thank you so much for this past hour that you spent with us. We are very appreciative. It was an outstanding, thoughtful presentation and answers to our questions. We're grateful in particular for your contribution to our program on a topic which enhances our understanding of the complex issues revolving around immigration. You brought a specific feature to that, and we appreciate it. And as a speaker whom we now know, that's you, you can be sure you'll have more followers of your writing and work in the future. So again, I'd like to thank you very much. Any last comments you'd like to make?
That's it. Thank you so much for all the thoughtful questions and being, I know Zoom is not always the best platform for staying engaged and listening, but I appreciate you all sticking around.
Our challenge is to get you to Savannah and meet you in person sometime. So thanks so much for a well done presentation. We really appreciate it. It was fun. It was fun.
Great. Thank you so much.
We appreciate in particular your sense of humor in dealing with us and our questions. So, okay, thank you again. And at this point, to conclude this evening's program, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Jose, our new president. Jose, it's all yours.
All right, Jim. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Britta, for joining us. I think we've been talking for almost a year now. When I don't know, when I first invited you to give us to be with us, I thought was actually we're gonna fly you in, have you in Savannah, and then the darn pandemic hit us. So, but thank you for joining us this evening through this strange thing that now we call Zoom for almost everything. So hopefully, in the near future, we can have you come and visit us and meet you in person. That would be wonderful. So first of all, I want to thank a big thank you for the members who are stepping down. It's I hope that you're stepping down just temporarily and do come back because you make a wonderful contribution to our organization. And I want to thank Chip, for guiding our organization the past 2 years. And I've learned quite a bit from him, and I hope that he's available for me to consult with him, ask him questions. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Please mark your calendar, Thursday, February the 18th at 7 p.m. Dr. Edmilson Bernardes will be with us. He'll be discussing, the topic of his presentation will be supply chains in the age of COVID-19. I think some of you may know Edmilson. He used to be a professor of logistics at Georgia Southern University. Now he's at West Virginia. So he'll be joining us, and hopefully you join us when we send out our monthly announcement or newsletter. You have a link, so please make sure that you sign up and join us again. So thank you for a wonderful presentation again, Britta. Good night, everybody, and I hope to see you all on February the 18th.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.